The prairie was restless that evening. Wind rolled like a ghost over the flats, carrying dust in thick clouds that scraped across the land. Each gust rattled the dry bones of sagebrush and whistled through the broken posts of abandoned fences. Out there, alone against the storm, rode a man, Jonah Keats, a rancher who had spent too many nights with nothing but his horse and his silence. His coat flapped against the wind, hat brim pulled low, eyes squinting against the grit. Through the dust, a shape took form. Not a homestead, not a tree, just the skeleton of a half-collapsed shelter leaning into the prairie like it was too tired to stand. Jonah slowed his horse. The place looked forgotten. Roof caved in, door hanging crooked. But there was a glow inside, weak, flickering. Lantern light. He dismounted slow, hand on his revolver, boots crunching dry earth. The door groaned when he pushed it open. Inside, huddled against the far wall, sat a figure. A girl, Apache, no older than 17. Her clothes were torn, dust coating her skin, but her eyes burned, alive, sharp, unwilling to die quietly. Jonah held the lantern higher, the flame trembling in the draft. For a moment they only stared at each other, two strangers caught in the same storm. Then her lips parted, voice breaking but steady enough to strike. "I can't live without a man." The words cut through the wind like a knife. Jonah froze, not sure if he'd heard right. He saw the bruises on her wrists, the torn hem of her dress, the tremble in her shoulders. Was it a plea? A warning? Or something darker, bait in a trap? The lantern light danced across her face, catching the hollow beneath her eyes. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls, rattling every loose board like bones in a box. Jonah's jaw tightened. He stood at the doorway, caught between compassion and suspicion, the silence heavy enough to choke. This was no ordinary night. And this girl was no ordinary find. The storm had not let up when Jonah Keats led the girl through the cabin door. The lantern hissed faintly, its light trembling against the log walls, painting both of them in gold and shadow. To any outsider, that cabin should have been a safe place. 4 walls against the prairie wind, a roof that held back rain. But as soon as the latch fell behind them, the air grew heavier. Safety turned brittle, fragile, like glass about to crack. The others were already inside. Clara, the widowed settler woman, rose from her chair with folded arms, her expression sharpened by suspicion. Eli, the hot-blooded youth, shoved away from the wall where he'd been leaning, fists already clenched. And Thomas, the silent hunter, said nothing at all, only watched the Apache girl with eyes that had seen too much violence to believe in innocence. The girl clung to Jonah's sleeve, her words from before still echoing in his mind. "I can't live without a man." He could feel the judgment ripple through the room as though the walls themselves had heard it. Clara's voice came first, low but cutting. "You bring her here, Jonah. But what is she to you? A stray? A burden? Or a curse waiting to fall on all of us?" Eli spat into the fire pit, sparks hissing. "I say she's bait. They send her in, soft and weak, and soon enough the riders come to finish the rest of us." His words were sharp, but beneath the anger was fear. The girl flinched at every syllable, eyes darting like a trapped doe. Jonah steadied her with a firm grip on her shoulder. "She's no trap," he said flatly. His tone carried no flourish, no need to convince. Just iron, still mistrust hung thick. Thomas finally spoke, voice rasping from disuse. "Doesn't matter what you say. Matters what comes after." Then he fell back into silence, sharpening a knife on the stone block with slow, steady strokes. The cabin was no longer just wood and nails. It had become something else entirely, a crucible, a place where every breath was tested, where trust cracked and suspicion grew like mold in the corners. The girl's presence was a spark. She could either kindle warmth or set the place ablaze. Jonah sat her down by the fire, giving her his own cup of coffee. Compassion was in his hands, if not in his words. Yet even as the fire crackled, his eyes never left the window. For every shadow outside looked like a rider waiting, and every silence inside felt like a noose tightening. The fire burned low, spitting embers into the smoky air, its crackle the only sound cutting through the night. Outside, the prairie groaned under the weight of the wind. Inside, the cabin walls groaned with it, timbers straining like old bones. The rancher sat closest to the flames, lantern light glinting off his weathered face. He said nothing, just stared into the fire, as if it might give him answers he'd spent years chasing. The girl sat a few feet away, her knees drawn to her chest, hair black as a raven's wing falling over her face. She had eaten little, spoken less, yet the cabin seemed to breathe differently with her inside it. Her presence was a storm in itself, unsettling, unpredictable, but impossible to ignore. At last, she lifted her head, voice soft and flat, carrying the weight of years no one her age should have known. "They came at night," she said. "White men. Some wore badges, some wore masks. They called it justice. But it was only theft." Her eyes flickered with the firelight, reflecting flames but showing no tears. "My father fought. My brothers, too. I was the one they spared. Or maybe they just left me behind, like ashes." She paused, jaw trembling for only a heartbeat. "I learned quick. Without someone, without a man, the world will eat you." The words cut the silence like a blade. Eli, the fiery youth, shifted restlessly on the floorboards, his jaw tight. His voice came sharp, spitting bitterness. "I know that kind of men. Worked under 'em, in the camps. Chains on my ankles, whip at my back. Said we were lazy, said we were nothing. I told myself one day I'd make 'em bleed for every lash. And I still will." He turned his gaze toward the girl, softening despite himself. "But you got fire. More than most men I seen." The maternal woman, Clara, stirred a pot hanging over the fire, her hand steady though her eyes glistened. "Family can betray you too," she whispered. "Mine did. Sold me to a man twice my age just to pay off their debts. I gave him children. Buried him too. When he died, I thought I was free. But freedom feels colder than chains when you're alone." She looked at the girl then, her voice firm. "You ain't alone here." "Not tonight." Thomas, the hunter, had been silent since the fire was lit. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch, worn thin at the edges. From it, he spilled tokens onto the floor, a feather scorched black, a fragment of bone, a rusted spur. He said nothing for a long while, just stared at them. When he finally spoke, his voice was dry, cracked with ghosts. "These are the only things left of the people I've seen fall. Some I hunted with, some I hunted down. Sometimes I can't tell the difference anymore." He closed the pouch with care like it was a Bible. "All I know is this land remembers, even if men don't." Jonah, the rancher, shifted forward, his boots heavy against the plank floor. His face caught the glow, hard lines softened by flame. "I had a wife," he began, voice low, nearly swallowed by the fire's hiss. "And a boy. Raiders took him while I was gone, rounding cattle. Came home to smoke and silence. Buried what I could find. Been burying myself ever since." His eyes lifted, not at the fire, not at the girl, but to some distant horizon only he could see. "Thought keeping quiet would keep the pain away. But it don't, just makes you hollow." The cabin settled into silence again, not the heavy silence of suspicion, but the solemn quiet of shared wounds. For the first time since they'd gathered, their eyes met not as strangers, but as people bound by survival, betrayal, and grief too heavy to carry alone. The girl leaned forward, voice steady now. "Then maybe we don't have to be alone anymore." The wind rattled the cabin walls, but inside, the fire burned steadier. For the first time, the mistrust that had clung to them like smoke began to lift. They weren't family, not yet, but under that roof, with ghosts laid bare in firelight, something fragile and defiant began to take shape. Midnight settled like a black veil across the prairie. The cabin's lantern burned low, its flame a trembling ember in the stillness. Outside, the wind carried whispers through the grass. But beneath it rode something heavier, hoofbeats, distant at first, then drawing closer, steady as a war drum. Jonah froze where he sat by the hearth, rifle leaning against his knee. Clara set her mending down, eyes wide. Eli, restless youth that he was, darted to the shutter and pulled it open just a crack. His breath caught. "Riders," he hissed. "Torches." The sound grew louder until the cabin walls quivered. Horses stamped and snorted in the dark. Firelight flickered through the cracks, painting long, crooked shadows across the rough-hewn boards. They were surrounded. A voice cut through the night. loud, mocking, full of cruel confidence. "Send her out." "The Apache girl. Send her out or burn with her." The survivors stiffened. All eyes turned toward the girl. She sat on the edge of the cot, her face pale in the lantern glow, her hands knotted in her lap. Her lips trembled, whispering words only she could hear. In the firelight from outside, her shadow stretched tall across the wall, a reminder of just how different she was. Gunfire cracked, sharp and sudden. Glass shattered as bullets punched through the window. One round buried itself deep into the doorframe, splinters showering the floor. Clara yanked the girl back, covering her with her own body as dust rained from the rafters. Jonah stood slowly, shoulders squared, rifle in hand. His jaw tightened, his voice gravel steady. "You tell whoever sent you." "She stays." For a long moment there was silence outside. Only the snorting of horses, the shifting of saddles, the creak of leather. Then the voice again, harsher this time, dripping with venom. "Then you'll all hang beside her." Hooves pounded. Torches wheeled in the night. The riders didn't rush the cabin, not yet. They wanted fear to do their work. Their laughter rode the wind as they pulled away into the darkness, leaving smoke, broken glass, and the stench of threat hanging in the cabin's air. Inside, no one spoke. The girl trembled, her wide eyes locked on Jonah. He didn't look at her, not directly, but his defiance had already answered her fear. That night, one truth sat heavy in every chest. The war for survival had begun. The cabin creaked under the weight of silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the prairie. Dawn was still hours away, but none inside dared rest. Everyone knew what morning would bring. The gang would return. They always returned. Jonah, the rancher, set his jaw and went to work. He dragged planks from the collapsed shed, hammer striking nail, each blow echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. Sparks flew as iron met wood, shuttering broken windows, turning holes into barricades. Every strike seemed to say the same thing. "We are still here." Eli, the fiery youth, watched closely. His restless hands itched for purpose, and Jonah finally gave it to him. He placed a rifle in the boy's grip, steadying his trembling fingers. "Don't rush," Jonah said, voice low as the prairie wind. "Don't flinch. Breathe with the land. Let the shot break on its own." Eli nodded, teeth gritted. For the first time, his anger sharpened into focus instead of chaos. Clara, the maternal woman, stitched cloth by lantern light. Torn coats became bandages, blankets turned into padding against the cold. She prepared food as well, beans, bread, and jerky, whatever scraps could keep them standing through what was to come. Her hands worked without pause, a rhythm born of years of survival, but her eyes flicked often to the Apache girl. Thomas, the silent hunter, ghosted through the shadows outside. He set snares along the tree line, strung tripwires with tin cans that would rattle if disturbed, and sharpened stakes into the mud where riders might storm. His movements were precise, economical. He spoke no words, but every trap whispered one. This land will bite back. Inside, the Apache girl did not sit idle. She carried stones, hefted beams, her strength startling in its quiet resolve. When the barricade rope was brought forward, she joined without hesitation. Together they braided it thick, binding wood and iron across the door. Her hair clung to her face with sweat, but her hands never slowed. The others watched. Suspicion that had once burned in their eyes softened. She was no burden. She was one of them. When the last knot was tied, Jonah stepped back. The cabin looked less like a tomb, more like a fortress, battered, imperfect, but alive with defiance. They gathered around the lantern. Outside, the storm pressed closer, wind rattling the shutters. No one spoke. Each heart knew what morning meant, and yet, for the first time, they did not feel alone. The night passed heavy and sleepless. Inside the cabin, lantern light flickered across pale, anxious faces. The survivors sat in silence, listening to the prairie winds as though they carried hoofbeats already. Jonah Keats, the stoic rancher, checked the rifle in his lap again and again, though it had been ready since midnight. His jaw was set like stone. He knew what was coming, and he knew the dawn would decide who walked away alive. When the first grey light of morning pushed against the shutters, the sound they had dreaded finally came. A low rumble at first, like thunder rolling far across the plains. Then clearer, sharper, the pounding of hooves. Dozens of them. Eli, the fiery youth, pressed his face to a crack in the wall, his breath quick. "They're here," he whispered. His voice carried no bravado now. Only fear trying to mask itself. The maternal woman, Clara, gathered what few supplies they had left. Strips of cloth for bandages. A pan of water. A dull knife she clutched tight as if it meant something. The hunter, Thomas, loaded his long rifle with steady, deliberate motions, every click of iron like a heartbeat. And the Apache girl stood near Jonah, her dark eyes lit with a quiet, unflinching fire. She had been prey long enough. This morning, she was ready to be a hunter. The riders came into view at the tree line, torches flaring, rifles raised. Their shouts split the prairie air, curses and threats mingling with the rising wind. Then with a cry they charged. The first bullets struck the cabin in a hail of splinters. Wood shattered, dust exploded into the air. Smoke filled the room almost instantly as Thomas fired back through a slit, his shot dropping a rider clean from the saddle. Horses screamed, men shouted. The storm had begun. Eli crouched low, firing wildly from behind the overturned table they'd propped as cover. His hands shook, but he didn't stop. Each pull of the trigger was louder than the last, a boy forcing himself to be a man in the space of heartbeats. Clara dragged him back each time he leaned too far, her arm shielding him as if he were her own blood. Jonah stood at the center, his revolver booming with steady rhythm. He did not waste bullets. Every shot was measured, every flash in his eyes calm and merciless. When the door rattled on its hinges, he braced it with his shoulder, firing point-blank through the gap at the shadows pressing close. The Apache girl moved like a spirit beside him. She had no rifle of her own, only a hunting blade and the will to use it. When a rider crashed against the side of the cabin and tried to climb through the window, she met him with a scream, slashing, driving him back into the dust outside. Her strength startled even Jonah, but he said nothing. This was no child begging for protection. This was a fighter choosing to stand. The gang regrouped, circling, peppering the cabin with fire. The air inside grew thick with smoke and blood. Clara worked furiously, pressing rags against Thomas's arm where a bullet had grazed him, whispering prayers between clenched teeth. Eli reloaded, face streaked with sweat and grit, shouting over the din, "We can hold 'em!" "We can," but Jonah knew it would come down to more than holding. It always did. The leader came at last. A hulking figure on a black horse, scarred face twisted in a grin as he bellowed orders. He dismounted in a spray of mud, kicking down the half-broken door with a crash. Rifle in one hand, knife in the other, he strode into the smoke-filled cabin like a man certain of victory. Jonah met him head-on. The world shrank to two men in a coffin of wood and dust. They clashed in a frenzy, rifle butts cracking skulls, fists shattering lips, knives flashing in the dim light. The fight turned savage, neither willing to give quarter. The floorboards ran slick with blood and mud as they struggled, each blow heavier than the last. The villain's knife slashed across Jonah's shoulder, dropping him to one knee. The leader raised his rifle butt high for the killing blow, and in that instant, the Apache girl struck. She lunged from the shadows with a cry that split the cabin's roar, her blade finding flesh. The leader staggered, shock twisting his face as blood poured hot from his side. Jonah rose, revolver in hand, pressing the barrel against the man's chest. One final thunderclap echoed through the cabin. The leader collapsed backward into the dust, eyes wide, lifeless before he struck the floor. Silence fell. Not the silence of peace, but of aftermath. The gang outside saw their leader fall. Their charge faltered, their courage broke, and one by one they turned their horses, retreating into the morning mist. Inside, the survivors stood gasping, bloodied but alive. Smoke curled in the broken beams, rain beginning to patter against the roof. Clara wept softly as she tied off Thomas's bandage. Eli leaned against the wall, chest heaving, eyes wide with the knowledge he had survived something greater than himself. And the girl, the Apache girl, stood with the blade still in her hand, her bare feet streaked with blood and dust. She did not tremble. She did not hide. She had saved the rancher's life, and in doing so, had claimed her place among them. Jonah looked at her, his eyes weary but proud. He spoke at last, voice low and certain. "You're no burden." "Not anymore." The cabin groaned in the wind, battered but still standing. And within its walls, so too did they. The prairie went still after the gunfire faded. The cabin walls, scarred by bullets and smoke, creaked like an old ship holding its breath. Then, as if the heavens themselves had been waiting for silence, the first drop of rain struck the roof. Another followed. Soon the sky opened, and sheets of cold water poured down, drumming against the battered timbers, soaking into the thirsty earth, carrying blood into the soil until the red vanished into mud. Jonah, the rancher, stood in the doorway, his chest rising slow and heavy. His revolver still smoked at his side, but the fire in his eyes dimmed as the storm did its work. Beside him, Clara gathered scraps of broken wood to patch the door. Eli, still trembling from the fight, pushed his shoulder against the wall to set a board straight. Even Thomas, the silent hunter, moved with quiet determination, resetting the traps not as weapons, but now as defenses of home. The Apache girl lingered last. She stepped to the threshold, the rain sliding down her face, washing away dust and tears. No longer trembling, no longer the fragile figure who had first clung to survival, she stood tall. Her dark hair clung to her shoulders, her gaze steady as she looked out across the plains. For the first time, she wasn't looking for someone to save her. She was looking forward, ready to stand. Inside, Jonah pulled a length of rope from the corner, one of the same crude coils the riders had brought, symbols of hanging and intimidation. Without ceremony, he dropped it into the fire. The rope caught quick, flames curling around it, hissing as rain dripped through the chimney stones. He didn't speak, but the act itself was louder than any words. The pass was cut. The chains burned. By dawn, the cabin no longer looked like a tomb. Its patched walls bore scars, but they stood firm, just like the people within. A new fire glowed warm against the fresh rain. The survivors ate together in silence, no longer strangers bound by mistrust, but something closer, not kin by blood, but kin by survival. And as the first light broke over the soaked horizon, the prairie winds carried no warning this time, only whispers of renewal. Out of fire and storm, a chosen family had been forged.